Hi, my name is Susan Reid and we're here at King Arthur Flour in the Baking Education Center, and today I'm going to show you how to make baguettes. Baguettes are one of the most classic artisan bread doughs that you can make, and it's amazing how something with only 4 ingredients can give people so much trouble. It's something that you need to practice. Don't expect a perfect baguette the first time out, but I'm going to take you through the steps. The first step is to get a pre-ferment made. This is a starter, so we're going to introduce some flour to a little teeny tiny bit of yeast and some water. So I have 4 1/4 ounces of flour here. This is all-purpose flour. You can also do this with bread flour. If you're going to make it with bread flour, then you're going to need a little bit extra water. So I'm only going to put a few sprinkles of yeast in here. Now I'm going to add 4 ounces of water. There we go. And I'm going to mix this up and let the yeast start working. Artisan doughs only have 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. That's it. But it's how you manipulate or work with those ingredients that makes the difference between a beautiful, crusty bread with nice big holes in it and something that is not quite what you were hoping for. So all we're going to do is combine this, and as you can see, where you start to see some stretchiness, the gluten is already starting to form, and this gets covered and the yeast gets to work overnight to start developing some flavor and get our dough started. We've given our starter plenty of time to do its thing. Look at those beautiful bubbles. This is all kinds of activity and flavor in this little bowl. So now we're going to build our dough. We're going to take the starter, put it in our mixing bowl, and we're going to add water to this. And how much you add depends very much on the humidity of your environment. Flour is like a sponge. In damp weather, it tends to absorb water, so you would use less in your dough. In dry weather, the flour can be very dry and it can need more water. So we're going to use 8 ounces of water right here, and I want to make sure I get all the nice little flavor bits still in this bowl. So I'm going to weigh 8 ounces of water, which is 1 cup. Stir it around, add that to our bowl. Some salt, and 1 more teaspoon of yeast. We don't have a lot of yeast in this recipe because we want it to work for a longer period of time to develop more flavor. The next thing that is going to go into our dough, 3 1/2 cups of flour. And make sure you measure your flour properly. A scale is the most accurate, but if you don't have a scale, you want to make sure that your flour is not really compacted. If you have too much flour in your dough, it's not going to rise well and your bread is going to be kind of heavy and tough. So you want to stir up your flour, sprinkle it into a measuring cup, just like this, and level off the top. And if this is done this way, your flour should weigh 4 1/4 ounces, which is exactly what my scale is showing me. Now, I'm going to just finish this up using the scale. So I want to get to 14 3/4 ounces. Now we're going to put this on the mixer, get our dough hook, and lift the bowl, and start it on a slow speed. And the hook is going to bring everything together. We will give this a few minutes to get the flour evenly moistened, and then I'm going to drop the bowl down and scrape the sides of the bowl just to make sure everything is getting mixed properly. And as you can see here, I've got some dry stuff still hanging out in the bottom and some wetter stuff still on the dough hook. So I'm just going to use the bowl scraper to get all of my dough together in one spot. Now we'll reintroduce the hook, put it back on the mixer, and we're going to let this mix for about 6 to 7 minutes until it's really nice and smooth. Don't go past the medium speed on your mixer. You don't want to pound the dough. You just want to bring it together so it's smooth and stretchy. One thing that you can do if you are not exactly sure how much flour or water to use is to hold a little bit of the flour back and wait until the dough comes together, and if it seems really wet and really sticky, then you can add the rest of it. And that way you'll have more control over the texture of your dough. Okay, let's take a peek at our dough. It has been mixing for about 6 to 8 minutes. And as you can see, it's nice and stretchy. Some serious gluten development going on there. So this dough is going to rise twice. It's going to rise for 3 hours, and then we're going to just very gently deflate it and then turn it over to redistribute the food for the yeast, and then we're going to give it another 2-hour rise. But meanwhile, we're just going to put our favorite cover on top of our bowl, which is a shower cap, and we're going to let this rise at a comfortable room temperature for 3 hours, give it a little turnover, and then another 2 hours. This is our dough after it's had plenty of time to rise twice. It rose for 3 hours, and then we deflated it, turned it over, and then it had another 2-hour rise. So it's time to deflate it one more time and begin to shape it. So the first thing I'm going to do is sprinkle a little bit of flour on top to help the dough not stick to my hands. And you can see from those nice bubbles that this dough is pretty happy. I'm going to flour my bench a little bit. You don't want to flour it too much because you're going to need some of that traction in a minute when we go to roll it. I'm just going to turn the dough over once or twice. Now I'm going to divide it in thirds. So I'm going to divide the dough in thirds. Now what I'm going to do is pre-shape, which means give the dough an idea of what shape I want it to be in afterwards and help it to gather itself. So I'm going to make it into a rough rectangle right now. Just pinch the seam closed and leave it like that. And by doing this, I'm going to give it a little bit of what's called the bench rest, which means the dough is going to be fairly elastic from having been moved around like this. And I want it to rest a little bit so it will relax and be easier to roll out into a baguette shape. So just like cranky children, sometimes a little 10 to 15 minute timeout can improve the behavior of the subject. So we're just going to cover these with some plastic and give it a 15-minute bench rest, and then when we come back, they'll be much easier to roll. While this dough is having its little rest under cover, let's talk a little bit about your oven. This is one of the things that makes true artisan dough at home a little bit difficult, because the artisan bread doughs that we make at our bakery are baked in a $60,000 huge square oven imported from France that is steam injected. So in order to replicate those conditions, you need to create some steam in your oven. There are several ways that we try to get people to create steam. We're going to spritz the baguettes a little bit with a little spray bottle to get started. Then we're going to put a pan of boiling water in the bottom of the oven, and just before the bread goes in. And there's enough, about a cup of water is enough. You don't want a lot of water because you need about 10 to 20 minutes of steam to start the bake. And then the steam needs to cook off so that the bread can caramelize. One other thing I wanted to talk about in your oven as far as steam goes, if you have a pizza stone, you definitely want to use it when you're baking any kind of artisan bread. The pizza stone really will soak up the heat and will give the heat back to the bread really quickly, and that's important to get that nice fast rise that we were talking about. So I recommend you preheat really for a good solid hour to make sure everything is totally warm. Now our dough here has had its chance to rest, and now I'm going to shape it. Now when you shape the dough, you're going to roll it out with your hands cupped over the dough so that you're not going to squish it flat. If you've ever rolled clay when you were a kid and you were using your hands flat, you know how you had like high spots and low spots, and then all of a sudden one piece would break. In order to keep that from happening, you want the shape of your hand to stay round. And what you're going to do is push against the dough with this part of your hand. You'll feel the dough gather itself up underneath your hands. And as you go back and forth this way, you want to work your hands out to the ends. So remember when I said you need to practice? This is one of those things that takes a little bit of practice. So don't be too upset if it's not exactly the way you envisioned it the first time. Now I'm going to fold the dough one more time this way and push it back against itself. You see how it starts to round up, it gathers itself? At this point you want to make sure that your bench does not have a lot of extra flour, because you're counting on the moisture from the dough to help grab onto the bench and help it gather itself up. So, and you see these nice little bubbles going on here. This is growing nicely. So I'm going to take this dough with my cupped hands and work from the middle out. And there's going to be a little seam. I'm going to make sure that's on the bottom. But that's pretty much all I'm going to want to do to this dough. I'm just going to gather this up and lay it out. Now, there's one. I'll go one more time. The trick is to keep just enough moisture on the bench to keep it, to help it round up, but you don't want the dough to stick or tear. So you're kind of walking a fine line. If you have too much flour, you can give it a little spritz with some water or just brush the flour away. And if it starts to stick, then you can just literally just take a little bit on your fingertips and just rub that spot. Now, we're going to have one more pretty long-term rise. Sometimes you'll find that this baguettes and artisan doughs will benefit from what I call benign neglect. If you sit here watching it, waiting for it to be ready, you're just going to drive yourself crazy. This is where you want to cover it up and go away for an hour and a half and do something else. Here are our loaves. They've had their last rise, but they're not quite ready to bake yet. There are a few other things that we need to do before they're ready to get into the oven. The first thing that we're going to do is do what's called a release cut. Now, we've talked about this bread having a big fast rise in a hot oven, so what I want to do is help the dough go into the shape that I want to do. This is something that I'm going to use what's called a lame. This is just a curved blade that's got a very sharp edge, and this is where artisan bakers really get to strut their stuff. Some people get really freaked out about this. You can't think about this while you're doing it. You just have to go. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And don't worry that it dragged a little bit. Just, you got to run with it. If you don't have a lame, a straight razor is fine, or a very sharp knife, but you can't go slowly because then you're going to pull the bread way out of shape. The next thing we're going to do is moisten the outside of the dough by giving it a little shower. And the next thing is going to be to put it in the oven on the stone. And here are our baguettes. We've taken them out of the oven. They've been baking for 25 minutes. Check them after 20, depending on how much heat your oven is carrying. And they may need as long as 30. You want to make sure that they're nice golden brown, and you should almost hear them crackling as they cool. But this has got a beautiful crisp crust. If you remember, when we slashed them, they sort of collapsed and they didn't look too promising, but that nice quick heat in the oven really did its job, and now we've got some beautiful baguettes.